Hello everyone, today we talk about the Viking military organization, stating in advance that we will deal with secondary topics that we will address during the video in dedicated videos on their own in the future. We didn't talk much about Vikings on Schwerpunkt merely by chance, but at some point hopefully we'll have to cover things like properly, Viking ships, the Herser, the Berserkers, the standard bears. I mean, every detail will have its own video. So today we talk about the military organization, which for other videos there were more for polities that had somewhat more, political and institutional structures. We talk about the army organization. More properly with the Viking, it's a bit different. I could have titled this, Scandinavian Armies Organization, something like that. Which means that, as always, this excludes tactics as well. Obviously, we will deal partly with it because there are important questions to point out relatively to the importance of cavalry or missile fire in Viking armies. All these things that are actually very important when hinted at before. But we rather frame today the problem in ways we actually already done in other videos, and from temporarily later perspectives, mostly to 11th to 13th century Scandinavia, basically about the construction of, say, the broader passage, let's put it this way, from tribal to monarchical Scandinavia. That, as we have seen, it was a very long process that is also somewhat difficult to trace, especially during the Viking era, about which we don't know an enormous much. The same Viking armies are somewhat unknown in general terms. We barely know something about the Anglo-Saxon army in a chain of command, things like this. You can imagine about the Vikings, but definitely we know also a lot of things that can help to frame the broader explanation, and especially not being tricked by those attitudes like, since we don't know this specifically because we don't have a source that explicitly says that, it's just a conjecture, right? Because if you broaden the horizon, something that history rarely, for certain academic reasons that we have discussed often, but unfortunately is going through, you can't really adopt, especially in military history, a broader logic that doesn't just mean by reasoning by analogy, but simply realizing that, if you find stirrups in a context of medieval Scandinavia and you associate it to a certain grave, it's not just because you can't say this thing is just about status, right? And this guy's actually didn't fight on horseback, because logics like these that are I just mentioned point out just by sheer example, because today I read something of very recent publications about this stuff, is actually a nonsense. I mean it has literally no historical meaning whatsoever. We will explain this better naturally in the Viking tactics video, but stating from now on immediately that we have a pretty clear understanding of what a tribal society is from history, from anthropology, from lots of fields, and we know more or less what Scandinavia was during this time. We know more or less how the thing began to transform. We can trace a pretty neatly shaped pattern after all, on average. I promise that we will really expand this far and wide. I mean, the example of cavalry, aside from the fact that there's plenty of evidence, of course, of Viking cavalry in the first place, but just even in pre-Viking time Scandinavia. So that's not that's a topic that fascinates me, the use of longbow, for example, or other issues that are related to Viking battle tactics and things will be dealt elsewhere. Today, as we were saying, we will focus mostly on the how the construction of more central power emerged at this point, how this can be considered objectively a path of civilization, right? That there is nothing particularly effective in just being scattered raids conducted by a few tens of ships just for short-term consumable loot, and that the Viking era displays this growth and this capacity of adaptation that naturally passes through to a great transformation, and even against the same tradition of the local communities, right? That naturally didn't like at all the idea of society growing more vertically, and the freemen having less power. But this is in a nutshell the history of the transition tribal societies towards something else, right? Something more organized, a state-like fashion. Always bearing in mind that, of course, even in here, there is not properly like a stage in which, the thing didn't exist before. Even at the beginning of the Viking Era, of course, there were kings. There were some forms of collective, training and military organization. There is a great debate about, for example, the Leidangr, about which we made a video specifically for slightly later times, from, basically low Middle Ages. Scandinavia, from which we get basically most of the information also about Viking Era, relatively to which we know very few, so much that people began to say, well, we know so few we can't say whether the thing was there or not before, if there was that degree of, collective organization, of central control. Well, there are people who say, that even in 6th century Scandinavia you can find things like that. I mean, as a broader form of organization, and the question, why wouldn't there have been, right? We constantly underestimate the organizational capabilities of every people around, their mobility, their logistical thinking, and here, Scandinavia is no exception, like for any other land. In fact, what I would like to leave you with is also that, we talk for reasons that I think are self-evident, Western civilization, about the importance of Viking Era, think about historiographically, the countries that it impacted, mainly think about British historiography and how the resonance that it had, we have conceptualized even a Viking Era, as a matter of fact, so we try to attach sometimes something, extra, characteristic to it that somewhat defines the differences with other realities. This sometimes even happens at a political level, but historically speaking, I mean, for political reasons that are actually not very historical. That's the point we're trying to do. But historically speaking, in fact, we can flatten most of the problems and the misinterpretations and the reinterpretations. I don't know, you want to think about it. Think about in popular culture how much this reality has, following, right? And how much, however, it seems that there is a few historical culture backing it, right? There are more, let's not descend into the details, of the political question, because maybe not even important at this point. But that objectively, look at Vikings, right? The famous TV series. That's something that completely, flips the, the logic that we're talking about in historical terms. That is the idea that, at the beginning there were these pure and free Vikings that wanted to raid around, and there was the evil king locally that prohibited them. No, because that's the establishment. That's the evil guy, and the thing. And then eventually they break this thing and they start building their own empire. Well, the thing is exactly the contrary, is that the Scandinavian society at the beginning of this period was very suspicious of the same Viking activity. Of course, it engaged itself in it, so, there is no real boundary in this regard. But indeed, as we were saying before, the say, egalitarian traditions that already at this point, by the way, in the same Scandinavia, were proper aristocrats. We have clan leaders, not much of freemen as mean them, if not in areas that were, even more peripheral to the same, we can't say Viking civilization, but let's say in the sense of, the greater levels of Scandinavian development, as, denoted by a very few, a very low per capita wealth, and, certain political and social situations were very far from bright, and prosperous, and that sometimes remained at the fringes of the Scandinavian world itself for centuries to come, right? Look at certain areas of Finland, for example. They even up to the modern age, there was this kind of very low social stratification. But this is exactly the point, like that there is a greater political and social system structuring as a machine, fundamentally as a predatory and self-strengthening system. There is no much of a civilization improvement, right? So this is as controversial as it gets. It's a bit the leitmotif of Schwerpunkt in here, that civilization does pass through things like exterminations, mass murders, destruction, all the crimes you can imagine, but in a logic that it is framed in, why, whose responsibility is really that one? Who is from the other side? Is it the victims really better than the carnifexes? It's really not, right? And most of the times, and it's a bit of the same reason why eventually the Viking era ended up, because it came essentially to expand in an era of collapse, of crisis, of major structures. See the Carolingian Empire, but on the long run, things like the Kingdom of England or say Kingdom of France emerged as structures that put an end to these raids, that blocked this thing. So you can say, oh well, because the Normans in Normandy conquered England, so it's technically Viking. No, the Normans that conquered England were not Vikings; they were properly Franks, and this has literally nothing to do with where they came from, because they weren't, first of all, just coming from Scandinavia in the first place. Secondly, that was the product of a Western Frankish society by every single standard, right? And we will also have to talk about the Normans in that regard, because there is a bit of re-edition of a reinterpretation of singling out the Normans as something unique and special, and for many reasons that even here are ideological. But the Normans basically were completely identical to the Franks by the time of William the Conqueror, and it's exactly the same system. So yeah, I mean, big deal what happened, no wonder about that. But if we're really looking at the thing, well, it was rather Anglo-Saxon England now being mostly an Anglo-Danish thing that was invaded and conquered by essentially a Western Frankish entity. And even in here that the Viking legacy is relatively low. Pointing especially out that there has been, once again, for reasons that elude fundamentally from a healthy historical interpretation, this idea of separating excessively even the peoples involved, right? Between the Scandinavians and the Anglo-Saxons, leaving aside the ethnic geographical origin of these peoples, it was objectively a low difference, right? Not so low to be overlooked or understated, because objectively Anglo-Saxon England was something more cohesive, more stable, more capable of absorbing even this this phenomenon of the Northman invasions, and even drawing strength at some point from it as a system. Or think even about the Franks, or the Germanic, Slavic, continental area. I mean, there weren't dramatic differences. We're talking about the High Middle Ages. There is not such a thing like an enormous deal of asymmetry between the societies. This is easily observable also, for example, from a military point of view. The Scandinavians, many occasions, actually proved to be able to deploy essentially the same tactics, even the same. Think about the siege of Paris, catapults, things like that belonged to this broader area that we can't separate quite neatly. Of course, there are big differences between what was being developed on the continent in terms of the vassalitic beneficiary system, the ecclesiastical structures, that were really something that on the long run took over Scandinavia itself, right? That's what it became fundamentally, and this is where the passage becomes more fascinating, because it's controversial, really. Look at Denmark. Denmark had a population essentially, the same population of Norway, Sweden put together, had greater resources, was closer to civilization. It grew more and better as a polity, as an institutional administrative system in a real kingdom that eventually was the most powerful one. Think about Knut's empire, just what they were able to accomplish on the long run, historically speaking, even just in the low Middle Ages, as Denmark having always this influence on Scandinavia, especially on Norway, and also southern Sweden, of course. But this is really where the meaningful differences really have to be pointed out, and we're kind of lucky because when there is a low asymmetry, it's somewhat easier to spot, or better to really make concrete what this difference is really about, right? And even if it's low, but this is another thing. So Today we talk essentially of this reality of Viking expeditions, that even in here we don't have to think to be concretely different from, I don't know, the military system of the Anglo-Saxons, right? We don't know clearly how this thing worked. We don't have the historical documentary evidence of how recruitment was really enforced, or simply, how the thing, especially at the beginning, was really the whole Viking phenomenon was largely spontaneous, right? But it was obviously still guided by certain clan leaders, right? So by certain, think about the Jarls or the kings, that in this sense were also a bit the structure of command, right? Viking armies were commanded by kings and Jarls, and for example, a Viking army recorded in Scotland was commanded by 8 kings and 20 Jarls, right? So imagine, even in here, when we talk about the need of centralizing, what this means. Think about 8 kings having to deal all together, with the strategy and all the problems that this could arise in a context that barely conceived the possibility of someone becoming kind of the single leader, because everybody felt at that point that they had to have their own share, and this was a pretty concrete problem that translated itself even, what about loot? What about the broader interests that the same strategical action will bring at the end of the war, and so on. There's 20 Jarls that were fundamentally the higher nobility. In this case, each one of them allegedly at least commanding about 1,000 men, right? You see that for a Jarl, typically speaking, the number would be some hundreds, right? Even here, categorizing is not really a good method, but just to give the scale of the average, more or less. And kings were either, let's say, national in the sense of this macro chunks, of course, of the Jutland Peninsula, Denmark, or Norway or Sweden, right? That at this point were starting to take shape as such in a way, and definitely the Viking era contributed to do so, like the military dimension of course contributes to shape the political and social one, but they could be essentially regional, provincial kings, sons of royal lines, or self-styled kings, right? Because who is a king? What's the even in here the scientificity in the denomination of these people concretely, especially in a society that is very, is not much stratified, so in which, especially at the beginning, it's relatively easy to, with a successful raid, to come home with a lot of wealth with which to build a new retinue and starting, other expeditions and expanding in that regard. And the Jarls were upper-ranked chieftains, right, more or less, or sons of royal lines as well, on the modern side, for example. And even in here, we have to think about the clanic tribal relations being extended throughout the Viking era in an ever larger scale, right? That by the mid-9th century, essentially corresponding to the collapse of the Carolingian Empire, not surprisingly, the Viking expeditions become larger, right? Think about the Michael Heer, or this broader armies that are not just larger but also come to to spend winter, for example, in the invaded lands, and to become more semi-permanent realities, at least in the threat, even in the deterrence that they can. Think about the Danegeld that we'll see in a while. So these were large enterprises of initially different people that would simply join because, hey, there is enough loot for everybody, I will take my share. But naturally these armies began to need a much greater deal of organization, of logistical support, and such large participations would entail naturally also transformation in Scandinavian society itself. Right, today we will not discuss about the reasons of the Viking era, because there are many people go from saying, okay, well, from the famous climatic change, from the fact that, however, there was a demographic overpopulation, the need to expand, colonize other lands, or because there were not, indeed, not much resources in Scandinavia to survive with. But it's also a bit too mechanicistic. The fact the Franks had knocked out the Frisian piracy, so the Scandinavians took their place. The threat posed by the same Carolingian expansion and the enforced Christianization of Saxony next door to Denmark. Lots of the same disgregation of the Carolingian Empire. Actually, today's historiography points out that, the imminent reason for the Viking era was loot, right? And objectively, there is not much room for something else concretely, right? Even to think that this was a clash of, civilizations or religious thing, it's excessive, right? Look at the Jom's Vikings that were, fiercely pagan, and they also served in Christian armies. I mean, this has nothing to do with that. At least in what triggered the military dimension from the major polities. But of course, we have to understand even here the spaces that were being covered. The fact that there's not just the west, there is the east. Think about the Varangians. Think about the revival of trade during, especially the late Viking era into the Eurasia, fundamentally, globally speaking. But the point I was making is that whatever triggered the Viking era is surely brought to an important change back home. Right, this meant that lots, especially of young people, because we see archaeologically speaking that just the hardships of that life, especially in a professional and military sense, could be undertaken by largely were teenagers, or people in their early 20s. There were grizzled veterans, of course, that fought well through their 30s. Therefore, the life of a Viking was extremely brutal and extremely short for what we can understand, and it was really wild. Like the toughness and the that same process of organization we're talking about before passed through the definition of new structures of discipline that were quite harsh and that required this all of a sudden, if you take the timeline of how the Viking era re-emerged, because by the way, what is the migration here? What was the Anglo-Saxon invasion of Britain, let's say, or still these other seemingly Scandinavian pirates that wander around during even the time of the late Roman Empire? It was essentially the same thing, right? But this thing re-emerged quite quickly, and think about the you have, it's like an equation a little bit. You have essentially almost non-existent statal organization in Scandinavia. It's so loose and unstable that there's no capability even of building major infrastructures, of having relying on this on something some pre-existing structures from a political military point of view. So you want to take it as far as starting to mount up this substantial maritime expeditions overseas, sometimes even far away, very, very far away, hundreds of kilometers, and you don't have that base. What's your only option? Well, that's largely what these tribal societies already had, where what the ancients would call it comitatus, right? This militarized lifestyle, life choice, and communities that essentially separated from what could be called as the Sippe, right? So the village, the more agricultural dimension. This is something we start seeing clearly ever since the Germanic peoples abandoned Scandinavia. That most of, the Germans that, during the Iron Age started, pouring into today's Germany, pushing south and west the Celts. At that point, originally speaking, they were not as warlike in Scandinavia. Of course, there were tribal societies with that degree of violence and warrior ethos, etc. But they were not as warlike as the bands, in fact, that left for those areas to choose a life of war, because there are not many other options. Wherever you go, coming out of your home is stepping in someone else's land, right? This is ferocious. This went on for throughout the same Scandinavia during the same Viking era that were brutal, some of the most inenarrable forms of violence that you can ever imagine in this context, because it was, normally part of the idea of this war bands of young men that since an early age, sometimes even, it was not much of an individualistic thing, but sometimes even an hereditary one. We'll see it better with the Berserkers, for example, in some instances at least, to join a life of loot, of rape, of fighting, of going out there to vent and to find a new land to live, right? And this is, in a nutshell, the history of all tribal societies. Like, there's not even a single tribal society in the world that has not based its survival, given the shortages of resources at home, on going in someone else's land, exterminating the men, the children, seizing the women, and taking the place of the previous order. This is really what human reality has been up to a few tens of thousands of years ago. As shockingly brutal and absolutely merciless as it sounds, this is humanity, right? And in those conditions, once again, as mind-blowing as it can sound, that was the better option. Like, it's not that these people went around because they were a bunch of brutes that didn't have anything better than not only killing other people, but getting themselves killed, because also the others wouldn't just stay there waiting to be massacred by them. But in this sense, it's really about a tribal society has to push in a world that is not just merely tribal, right? During the Viking era, start seeing, think about the great armies we were saying before, major expeditions, major, strategic horizons in general to consider and to be covered, and therefore doing it, and starting to do it, by the way, with dealing with the local realities. Like the Vikings, this is another key of interpretation of their reality. Weren't just mere aggressors in the sense that one day out of the blue take Lindisfarne, also the previous raids in the 80s of the 8th century. These guys showed up, exterminated, looted, went away, deported. These were obviously pirates, slave traders. Look, the whole, look at the Mediterranean, look at the North Sea, the Baltic. That's a commonplace. It's always been like that since, it was normally like that since ever, right? And the idea here is that the Vikings start being literally hired by other peoples, start being, incorporated into the system. The Anglo-Saxons at a certain point simply have to give up. But the same Carolingian, and to give them land, as and accepting the coexistence with them in Britain. But the same Carolingians actually began to send Vikings one against the other between the Western Franks and Eastern Franks on a regular basis. They start coping with them, start training with them. Actually, we know of Franks, of Anglo-Saxons. Think about the Northumbrians that didn't like much Wessex, for example, in its expansionistic phase, to join the same Vikings, because that's what politics is. This is literally the ABC of human civilization. Now we seems strange, seems weird. We need to make the factions saying, those are the Vikings, those are the Anglo-Saxons. The thing was much more blurred than we think. Think about all the Carolingian noblemen that didn't like quite, the monarchic control on their land, that begin to side with the new invaders, because they say, hey, as long as, this area is unstable, the king cannot intervene. I can do whatever the heck I like, because these guys at a certain point are going to go away. This is at least, probably, a Norman count around the beginning of the 10th century would have, bet on the wrong horse in that regard. But, elsewhere in Gaul, objectively, there was even, this is often not, stressed enough, but also, the ways that the Anglo-Saxons and the Franks dealt with the Vikings was, partially successful. It's not that these systems were overrun. The Vikings suffered around fair share of defeats, and the Viking era came to an end. Think about the Battle of Stamford Bridge, the death of Harald Hardrada as the symbol of Viking era. Actually, the Vikings continued, but just in a more institutionalized fashion, right? There were Vikings going to the Crusades. That this is conceptually important. This is the same years, but of course they're being reduced into another, to other levels, and that's what brings to the end of piracy. Like, piracy exists as long as there is an unstable situation. As long any big empire crumbles, marauders, pirates, that's what they do when there is a weak central power. When central powers then begin to strengthen with the vassalic beneficiary monarchies by the 11th century, this thing starts to end, right? And that explains a lot, right? I think that political and social explanations are way better than, much else that might have surely contributed. I don't know, the warming of the climate. Yeah, why not? But this is usually used to explain the demographic growth. But the most sophisticated historiography today says, okay, well, do we have to always talk about this as a factor? While don't humans try to expand normally as soon as they have the opportunity after there's been a contraction of some sort? I mean, it's obvious that monofactorial explanations usually do not have much of a success. Talking about properly the nucleus of a Scandinavian army during the Viking Era, well, this was the Hird, right? The Hird. Its members, the Hirdmen or Thingmen, were paid retainers, substantially. We had sworn their allegiance to the king or jarl, right? Jarl has basically the same etymology of earl, right? We know in Anglo-Saxon England, we made a video about the Anglo-Saxon military army organization, that the earls had a duty, a political institutional role within the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and later kingdom. As in Scandinavia, national monarchies were yet to come in this perspective, but we're talking about similar things. The same Hirdmen, chieftains, we can say, the Herseer, weren't that different from the Anglo-Saxon Thanes after all. We'll see this figure. The Herseer were initially some, local landowners in Scandinavia that had, their own power. They were, somewhat clan leaders, or however, having their own clienteles and managing the area for, the higher powers like the jarls or the kings. That later on they became also in this, looser authority in Scandinavia, the same organizers of the Viking raids, autonomously later on framed under the same, of course, this broader, kingdoms or jarldoms, etc. And the Thane was something fundamentally similar. We're talking, of course, about clan-turtle society. It wasn't much of a difference after all. And the Hirdmen emerged at this point as a sort of permanent or semi-permanent military force in Scandinavia. What does this mean exactly? Well, it means, of course, that since the ancient times, of course, the main aristocrats had their own military retinue. There are people that lived in their own households that received essentially in this redistributive process armament, loot from the chieftain, right? They were considered sometimes even in a sort of broaderly, or let's say maybe towards the chieftain proper in a father to son relation, right? The chieftain was the old man, right? And the one who, as we will see now, was also conceived more in a political rather than military fashion. Not that the military element didn't lack in here, but it's a bit the difference between Odin and Thor, right? Odin and Thor. This idea that the truer and higher deity of war is not the young, bold, beefy man that smashes enemy skulls like eggshells, but the old man, right? That's the figure of Odin, right? That naturally has its own emanations. It enters in the field of this blind fury on the battlefield that is really a divine thing. It's really something that puts in connection with the deity of the skies, of this military glory of this tribal world that was universally regarded as the raison d'être proper of manhood, right? Because here theoretically old men were conceived as warriors. The things had already changed, right, a bit. Even at the same beginning of the Viking era, It wasn't like that, and that's where before we were talking about the difference between the comitatus and the zippe, right? Because these guys, the herdmen, would start becoming as retinues of this major of these chieftains, as a force that basically lived by him, right? It's not that they were engaged all the time in warfare, but that was their primary function. At least they knew how to fight. They had times and resources to train in that sense. While the majority, like think about the bondi, the farmer, free peasantry, was presumably throughout all the Viking era, Scandinavians were normally into some competence into raid scale warfare. They knew definitely how to use a bow, an axe, a knife in combat and all these things. But the idea is that, and a spear, of course, because that's the principle. Think about Odin's Gugner and all the meaning stemming from it, in a sense, properly of manhood. And the arrival of the sword and the horse, in this sense, is a transformation from that tribal context that regarded even the simpler forms of armament or military organization as the norm, right? That's what the herdmen properly were, right? And while Scandinavian society naturally had this idea of the general levy freeman that we will see better later with the Leidang, and that was mostly novelty oriented, because sometimes it's, especially in certain areas of Scandinavia, it's not that there's much of an option. Look at Norway, but that theoretically encompassed the whole free man population, right? The idea, the enemy attacks, everybody takes up arms and goes to fight. But that's just a system of essentially of militia that has nothing professional or not even semi-professional in it. The herdman starts becoming a semi-professional, and on the long run it's elite, because we will see how the herdman starts to stratify, to segment within itself, to hierarchize in this sense, to become properly professional. Think about the Oscars, literally meaning the guys who lived in the lord's household in Anglo-Saxon England, that as Scandinavian professional troops, we've seen it in the Anglo-Saxon military organization, entered, if anything, definitely individually, but there were also some Anglo-Saxons, our people joining in that, but probably as a professional element of the Anglo-Saxon army that starts seeing the decline even of the Thane's system of organization of recruitment, and that there is a much greater divide between the professional elite and the freemen, right? And this is interesting because if you look at places like Francia, for example, well, there the thing is way more ahead in this regard. There is no comparison. That's why the Anglo-Saxon Huscarls and fair fights against the Normans, William the Conqueror, as as mostly foot soldiers, and whereas the Normans have essentially heavy cavalry, right? That's the divide in stratification of the respective societies. There's a major difference, but the difference in relative terms had already been present in the same societies, right? All over the Viking era, the thing had developed in that direction unequivocally, right? Together with the structuring of monarchies and of more complex military forms of military organization that also entailed in that regard. For example, the fact that the freemen didn't have to go to war anymore; they could simply pay for someone else to go, right? And that's something that happened very gradually in Scandinavia, because that's actually a place where it remained probably longer than in other places. But this is simply because their political institutional structures were fundamentally weaker than the others in continental Western, say Frankish Europe, from some point onwards, right? And there is also foreign mercenarism, obviously, right? Scandinavia here is acting more or less in the same way. The people go by sea. There is this intense, military activity that involves even the development, the expansion of the same Viking markets did, as we all see, the foundation of new trade centers in other lands. Think about how many, basically all the major Irish cities that derive from this Viking entrenched camps, but even the same Scandinavia, it's basically the same along the coastal, the Baltic Sea, etc. So there is literally the structuring of something more than just tribes. And as early as 885, Harald Fairhair, the first king to, let's say, unify, it's a big word, but still extending namely control over at least most of Norway, may have decreed that each jarl, so this higher nobility, should maintain 60 men, and that beneath him a minimum of 4 hersir, so these local military commanders or organizers, as we have seen, and that should maintain 20 each in turn, right? These are scattered informations that do not tell us how the system numerically worked elsewhere in Scandinavia, but still gives us essentially both the dimension, the scale of how this military organization functioned, right? And at this time the Scandinavians were still pagan, right? This is important to remember. Their herds contained large numbers of so-called Berserkers, warriors that were thought to be the chosen ones of Odin, right, the father of the gods, etc. The Berserkers were at this point undergoing a bit of the same changes that we were talking about before. We will have to make a video on actually more than one video on the Berserkers, because it's an important chapter of tribalism that once again has not strictly to do with just with the Norse world. You can find it everywhere in Siberia, North America. It's basically the same exact thing in every single tribal society, and it was based on this concept that it was actually connected to the comitatus, to this life fundamentally at the margins, if not properly outside civil society. Let's put it in this way, because of course the Scandinavian villages and communities in general had their own, of course, civil organization. It was mostly oral, and it functioned. It was regulated, also religiously speaking. Religion essentially was, you can easily see it in the colonization of Iceland. That there was, it was a controller over the ambitions of these, greater clan leaders that could take over the freedom of the community. But outside of this world, there were these somewhat outcast warriors that lived literally in the wild, and that essentially took this way of life that was psychologically toxic, but fundamentally based on the concept that they had been called by the divinity to assume essentially the spirit of some of the creatures that were dear to them, symbolized them. If you think about the bear, think about the wolf, this battling slash in the case of the wolf, especially necrophagous animals, were connected to the world of the dead, right? The crow. Think about the crow. The idea that the dead warriors that would all ideally go in the Valhalla, where Odin would be the great chieftain that would reward them every day, essentially with a new life and equipment for fighting for eternity. And think about that. This was the dominating view. So think about how the military aspect was central to this society. So the idea that your heaven is basically a place where you can fight forever, instead than maybe staying a bit having, because their lifestyle was really about that, right? This fight and all these great banquets where actually people would kill each other, regularly, but where stories of the wars, tales of war would be told, and it was all fundamentally about that. And of course, the necrophagous animal was the point of connection embodied that was sacred to Odin himself in this regard. That had, as had hanged himself to apprehend as a dead man the meaning of the runes and this, therefore magic reality that connects the world of the living, the world of the dead, right? So we will see that crows, for example, figured prominently in the Viking banners. We'll have to make a video about that at some point. That because of all this Odinic ideal that would trigger this state, in fact, of trance and possession that literally came, in the case of the Berserkers, from the skins of the animal proper, and that these people would simply and could not come out. Right. This began in this military brotherhood simply because every brotherhood was of course religiously framed. They all had their own tutelar deity. Of course, paganism, there were many shrines and sanctuaries in Scandinavia that also probably had a territorialized importance for the local communities, etc. So the thing was relatively less standardized, and even the Odin naturally was this not much of a god as we intended, but as an entity, as a presence, as a central essence, entity, we can say, not even a figure. It's difficult and impossible basically to explain for our mindset, but overwhelming, dominating, right? That's why before we were saying how Odin is way more important than Tyr. That is just more like the youth, that the strength that is gonna pass, right? That's for the young kids that joined the first raid, right? But it's obvious that the 40-year-old, scarred from head to toe, herdman is looking upon Odin also because he understands his life. His life has is going towards an end, right? And this, it's difficult to explain proper the even the taste of this atmosphere. We can't, but it's very fascinating, as you understand. But it was essentially what the warriordom of tribal societies was all about, right? It's almost of a universal scale. If you look, just change, the words, maybe the tutelar animals, because the landscape changes, but all over the world there is this idea that the warrior has in this stage. And originally speaking, the Berserker was, a big deal in combat, because in this tribal societies, literally, there wasn't much of a structure and collective discipline to cope with a guy that basically went to war thinking to be literally a raging bear and smashing everything without even thinking about. So properly berserk, exalted and careless, pushed everything on this burning, consuming moment that was probably helped also by some sort of substances, like the herbs or drinks, etc. That made him literally break through the average farmer that was maybe not much of a coward or incapable in fighting, but that could not meet with a person that literally lived like an animal, as a wild predator in his entire life. And this is the deal, right? The Berserker transforms itself during the Viking era, probably in the center of it, into something else, right? These guys still have an impact on the field, but they're trying to be framed now by this more organized military systems. They are, somewhat elite troops. We know of that in certain cases it was even hereditary. There was a guy who had 12 sons that all, were berserkers that would fight together. Such the concept of brotherhood here is very important, because as we have seen in those war bands that were the part of this comitatus and figuring that this berserkers, higher or lower degree, there was this sworn oath of allegiance that compensated for the lack of central authority as a gluing factor that would make these people literally die instead of just giving way during the fight, or they had there was a brutal competition, right? There were certain selections, just the ritual of entrance in these war bands was bloody, right? People, they made human sacrifices. They were even, the idea is that their lives properly didn't belong to them anymore, so that they were simply to keep them away had the situation required that in combat, and that's how they compensated for the lack of a superior authority that could enforce discipline on them. And these berserkers, on the long run, we know that they weren't just brutes and wild beasts. They were actually pretty skilled and well trained. Like all this, there was this even in the more civil society's habit of fostering children in other households. This expanded during the Viking era as the status of people increased. Of course, this happened also in the Carolingian world, in everywhere in Europe and elsewhere. And in the simpler Scandinavian societies, mostly was deputed to like your uncle, for example, could be another guy. So that reveals the lower stratification, the fact that there weren't many other places you could send your child to learn how to fight. And we know how this society is typical of warriors. We're skilled in things that we can't even that we have lost the mindset of physicality for, right? It's laughable when you see bodybuilders that are into Vikings because they think that that's how Vikings lived, like having this beefy muscles, enormous, and say, oh yeah, I'm a Viking now. That there are people like that for that. This guy, what they really concentrated in were definitely physical strength was an enormous deal. We know, of course, of the power of it, but that's not something you get just by looking beefier. But naturally, these guys were skilled in weapons, right? And in weaponry, in fighting, we know of proofs. We're also pretty risky. Like think about when Tacitus says of the young men that were making running naked among the spearheads. They knew how to perform all this complicated fencing, know how to throw a javelin with both hands, right? All these proofs that they competed all together, and there was a brutal selection. I mean, these people were brought down. You can't even imagine how psychologically devastating and traumatic this world actually was. I mean, psychoanalyzing a Viking would be, probably something, looking at the nightmares of, can imagine the most radical forms of psychophysical abuse and sheer cruelty that was imposed within these brotherhoods. And if you were, lucky to come out, to come of age in this reality, you were ready to go out there and do the same exact thing to any single person you would find fighting against you, right? And this is what the whole deal of these societies were. You don't have a centralized state that can give you the necessary discipline in a collective fashion, so you don't have it. No. So you overemphasize the individualistic side of the story because, that will not work as, a disciplined professional army in a tribal context, but it's literally the best you can do. Well, with the Berserkers, this is what goes on. That they are gradually framed into this, instead, more expanded, more, properly intelligent military system that develops during the Viking era on a larger scale with greater organization, greater coordination, collective training. These guys are used as spearhead formation. They're provided now actual good equipment, and they're, during the Viking era, gradually armies become heavier, right? But on the long run, this thing doesn't work anymore. Like, these guys are anachronistic, right? They can't be knocked out pretty easily by, I don't know, an Oscar warband at that point. And it's literally their lifestyle. If you live in the woods compared to who lives in a household who owns weapon guards, you have a, what's your shot? So much that at the end of the Viking era, the Berserker is fundamentally just an outlaw. That there were a bunch of mountaineers that lived in the wild, and that the local bandits would look, beware of, because they would steal their cattle, maybe kill and rape and kill, or the order is indifferent at that point. Their family, but that's pretty much it, right? And they fade away. And this is the point: is that this thing of the Berserker doesn't die there, right? Because it lives on in medieval chivalry. It lives on in, in the instinct within humanity proper. So, but just for speaking of realities that here were quite devastating for our time standard, but they were somewhat normal in the context, in the logics of the time. There was actually an iron strong logic, like these people all had a function in their respective context, because otherwise they would have not existed. This is just for the Berserker in in a nutshell. Then, as we're saying, but since the beginning, we'll make a video on that at some point, more than one. We know of Olaf II of Norway, Saint Olaf as a matter of fact. Christian, but still a pagan warrior fundamentally. 1016, 1030, we're in the late Viking era. Having a herd of 120 men residing at his court and consisting of 60 herdmen, the elite of the herd, plus 30 huscarls and 30 jesters. That, as we will see now, the jester was, as far as I understand, as a sort of retinue for the same herdman. Sometimes I find it associated, but I think it's just an hypothesis to like a lighter trooper, like a long bowman, and it's possible that there was even this tactical segmentation on the field. So here in the late Viking era, we see under the Norwegian king how the thing was segmented, right? So there was an elite, then the main body of these troops, and then their retainers. And Harald Hardrada himself is meant to have had the same exact number of troops at some point, segmented in this way, and these were doubled to therefore 240 by Olaf III, 1068, 1093. And in addition, there were other of these troops posted elsewhere in the kingdom. This is very important because it makes you understand how the territorialization of power worked, right? Kings at this point have the possibility of, connecting their own strategic resources, right? They have these troops that are fundamentally garrisons. They become as, landlords in turn, in a way. They acquire their own prerogatives, but they stem from the royal clientele. So there is this connection that otherwise would have not been. Otherwise it would have been simply another local jarl who said, here, I don't want kings coming to rule over me, and then I would fight back. And this is basically the history of Scandinavia in a nutshell, at least for what concerns domestic policy. And as we were saying before, the jest was this lower echelon of the herd retainers that seemingly was established by the early 11th century, possibly a little bit later. And that, what does it mean? Well, of course it means that the herdman has acquired more weight, right? The squire the attendant you can start finding in, Carolingian army for the knight, right? Here is, after these guys that sometimes were horsemen themselves, were starting being actual knights. You have to think armored cavalry. There is a lot of debate, as we were saying in the beginning, about Viking cavalry. Did they have it? They had it. They had it for sure. It was mostly used for raids, for scouting and so on. But actually, we have evidence of battles in which the Vikings fielded even substantial amounts of cavalry in a shock function. These weren't naturally as developed and collectively trained and armored as the continental cavalry of the Frankish world, and the same Normans that settled in the lower basin of the Sand River at the beginning of the 10th century with Rollo will actually learn how to go on horseback by the Britons in Bretagne, in fact, and also by Western Frankish influence. I mean, they will become something else, not because these guys didn't know how to go on horseback. We find, in Scandinavian culture, in Scandinavian society, the idea that the war hero is and the prince, the fight, the theater of the situation, is on horseback. The horse has a name. There is a very strong relation between the warrior and his horse in Scandinavian society way before the Viking era. The question of whether the Vikings used shock or heavy cavalry or not is a mechanicistic categorization typical of modern mindset that also doesn't reveal much of historical awareness. Of course, cavalry was all over the place in Scandinavia. Denmark has actually good breeds, and we know that the Swedes had, of course, we find even warriors of the steppes, at least steppes panoplies in Sweden, that was easily exposed to, up to the Caspian Sea through the the Russian waterways. The difference, as we were saying before, is that this cavalry is maybe on average more poorly armored. At least this cavalry does exist with full armor, but it's more rare overall, considering the population. But especially there is not much of a collective training at that point. That is what you could have under a much more stratified, Carolingian society with a Berserkers, and someone could train and gave enough resources to train these clienteles and equip and so on. In Scandinavia, this thing is much flatter, right? So that's the real deal. It's not that they didn't have it, it's that their collective training was lower. And collective training is literally what makes the greatest difference in warfare. And that's why pointing on the individualistic warlike thing is the proof of a more primitive system on average. Then in fact, when it becomes more evolved, more advanced, invests in the kind of more articulated, more functional, more complex and regulated military system. And that changes the lifestyle, and that has a cost, of course, but that is also effective for making this system to transition, in fact, in what they will become, kingdoms, something more, more evolved. So it's not that people lived better, in 7th century Scandinavia than in 13th century Scandinavia, right? Everything has its own place, its own motivation, and overall with it well over time. And one has to accept it, as much as the fact that, of course, the Vikings took a lot from the rest of Europe, right? The fact that they were now meeting something different from what they had always been facing home, right? Carolingian cavalry is not something you kid with, right? If you don't have equally, political and military structures to match, right? So this is particularly important. Of course, they had cavalry, and the figure of the jester here, is appearing, in fact, towards the end of the Viking era, reflects that need of attendance, of, someone would take care of the herdman. Now had become, a bulky thing to train, to equip. It was ever more costly and had to be, assisted, even in combat. And the jesters were also employed, seemingly, as tax collectors, or maybe administrators. This is something that back in the day the heirs would make. Now this were kind of lower. The same organization, as we have seen increasing, has the need of people who take care of it from just an administrative point of view. And they received, however, they had a military function themselves, receiving 1/2 of the pay of a herdman, and likewise only half the rewards handed out after a campaign. So this reveals naturally also their, not just their subordination, but the tactical differentiation as a consequence. It's been suggested that retainers might have divided into 4 units, as we have seen before, with, for example, with the organization under Harald Fairhair. Each of this unit further subdivided into a number of smaller troops, possibly on a decimal basis. Right, in Scandinavia there is, for example, the 100, that, however, means 120, the so-called long hundred, which obviously correspond, organically speaking, to a company. So this was the main tactical unit on the field, and each one of these companies was responsible for its own disciplinary course. What does this mean? It means that these companies evolved on the base of the previous warbands. They had their own oaths, their own esprit de corps, and we know it's still today. Like, the company is basically the first, it's the main tactical unit you really embody, identify yourself with. Of which you can know all the components. Like the reason why companies are between up to 150 men, it's because literally the human brain is made to maintain in mind roughly that 150 faces, and being able to attach a specific information to them, and this is what is needed by the commander to employ them in combat on the basis of their respective abilities. And this is why this is the central, the 100 is or long 100 is the central unit in here that has because it's the largest autonomous unit on the field. The one is commanded by an officer that is on the field himself, right? And this is being connected also to the that during Viking expeditions, these hundreds corresponded to ships fundamentally, so they would also have this proper unit and a spirit corps that they characterize themselves in a way or another. And consider in this regard, as we were saying before, is that this hierarchy is very loose. I mean, the companies would be very autonomous, also just from a political, military point of view on their own as single entities. These were the bands were probably also singularly hired by whoever hired them. We know some other figures like the senior hired officers, such as the Salaris, that is the marshal that appears at some point in the late Viking era, that has to do, probably with the function even of cavalry at some point. At least if we find a comparison with the marshals in other military systems. Then the Merkismadr, so the marksman, who actually was the standard bearer, right? And there was a lot of importance now, as you know, attached to him. And these probably rose through the ranks. There was a lot of pride, and these banners had all a symbology, as we have seen before, that is really the true identity of the army, right? The symbol of a crow, of other figures, of the dragon, etc. It's what you are, because you have sworn an oath of allegiance before joining this unit, and now you are that unit. You're not an individual anymore. You're the unit. This is how the only way humans in civilization have been able to create an effective military, by saying that no matter what, you are out there to kill your enemy, and you will make it, and that's the only functional way of doing. So you see here the thing taking shape and intensive and being regularized. The Herdmen provided with mercenaries and pirates that were basically, often the same thing. The bulk of Viking Raiders, right? These were the people who, just think about, your personal life. I mean, you, of course, as we've seen, Scandinavians at some point begin to need to go away, literally with all their families, and trying to find new lands to settle, and sometimes suffering setbacks from, think about America, or other situations where at some point, however, they mostly settled down and mixed with the local population. Think about Ireland, think about Normandy, or even of course Anglo-Saxon England, and more Scotland, etc., Russia, and the list is long. And they were therefore the people who, however, from in the regular Viking expeditions, the ones enacted from Scandinavia to the surrounding world and repeated for the sake of loot, principally, were the people who literally abandoned what they had at home. So they had either properly entered into these companies under some lord, right? So it's as if they had come out of the civil society to join the military one. It's difficult to draw a distinguishing line in Viking in the Scandinavian society, because as we've seen, these are warlike cultures by their own, right? But the divide, the difference increases over time, and the construction of more robust political and military structures passes through the detachment of these people from civil society, because it passes fundamentally through war. So these people have to be literally, taken from one place and brought to fight somewhere else for a very long time, right? The military service actually was owed, was on paper small, especially for the local militias that were in fact the peasants that had to come back home to produce agricultural goods to make the whole system survive. So it couldn't be asked for more. Also because these communities, by the way, were still relatively strong, so they couldn't the kings couldn't ask for much. But of course, a professional herdman was out there simply saying, okay, I depend on my chieftain. I will do whatever he says, and I will fight wherever and whenever he needs. So there is a different mindset that develops in parallel, in a properly professionally military sense. And the herdmen costed a freaking lot. You have to equip them. You have to feed them. Exactly because they're not much of self-sufficient anymore. I mean, sometimes, as we've seen before with Norway, they would be given land to rule, and they probably, were sustained by the local resources. But, this took form also in different ways. Think about the Danegeld. The Danegeld was exactly exacted for the maintenance of the herd. The Danegeld, it was this tribute of money, eventually identified literally with the eastern coast of England, for the Danish had settled during permanently after the various raids on Britain, with this tribute money levied from the Vikings. We can't say victims, like it's a sort of unreliable protection racket system. Right. I consider this. What does this? What we didn't insist very much here is also the familial relations, the clanic relations. Like, this is like hush money. This is the mob, right? You have to think that before the modern state, it's not that societies were like the mob. They were, by definition, the mob. All this emphasis on pride and honor, on the word, on the loyalty, and I think, what is this? This is mafia, and it's exactly how it works. I mean, there is no difference of any sort by definition. With all the with all the the controversial side of the story, because a modern state at the time would have been anachronistic. There weren't the structural resources to make it work. So this was literally the best way to make the world go around. And you can imagine what a mafia-dominated world looks like. And that's where you get the sheer violence that we associate to, just to those worlds in general, and the also the instability and all the limits that this system had. But there were systems in expansion, though. The Saxons, as we've seen, were particularly, the Anglo-Saxons were particularly subject to this. The last special Danegeld gathered in England being in 1018, right, for Knut the Great, to pay, in fact, not surprisingly, off most of his invasion army, right? So it was like, it's not that the military contributions, the military system and the recruitment system worked much differently in the other lands. The point is in here there is a certain imperialistic system that in this case, think about the Great coming rule over Denmark, over Norway, over England, and therefore this thalassocracy. All this money is meant also to field ships, right? A navy. We will see now in a while, and this stuff costs enormously. It's not much about the ships. It's not even much about the weaponry. It's about food. Right, it's about these people. You have to maintain them on the field, and they consume a freaking lot. There are horses. A horse eats an enormous amount of stuff daily, and you need that if you really want to have a shot in this world. This, all this system is speeding up. Denmark builds its own fortifications, its own walls. It needs this money. And this is very important because it's obviously, sucking away resources from all these dominated areas that eventually are concentrated in Denmark, and structuring, in fact, what will become the most powerful kingdom in this context, and later on to come. But also because naturally, then the other countries would have been the same if they had the same resources Denmark had. It's a cycle. And it was probably for the accommodation of Svein and Knut's Tinglith, or they're basically distinct men, herdmen, and other professionals, that the great Danish fortified, in fact, camps of at Trelleborg, Aggersborg, Firkat, and Nonnebakken, right, that were all built essentially in the early 11th century. And between them, these could house a standing army of approximately 5,500 men. Right, this is a legion, right? This is a division, basically, and this shows you also, of course, looking at these archaeological remains and the surfaces, etc. You can't calculate how many people they could be housed. And think about this. I mean, it's not bad, right? It's for a power of that times, of those times and places, right? 5,500 men for one single fortifications really means that there is a hell of a military system going on that, not surprisingly, is paralleled by and it's directly due by Knut the Great's empire, right? And the semi-legendary Joms Vikings were probably similarly organized. They were this select military brotherhood on the pattern that we have explained before, of men between 18 and 50 years old, right, with strict codes of conduct. Now, an interesting thing about these brotherhoods is that it's from there, in the absence, as we've seen, of a sovereign power, that the disciplining process starts, right? All that tough selection we were talking about before, it's always been there. Now it's intensifying. I mean, troops were starting being selected for their tactical roles, for their, career, their rank promotion, on the base of those proofs. That the idea that they had to be very careful, they didn't, they had to obey. This is something that is starting being enforced with violence within these units, and because finally there is enough concentrated power for these communities to enforce it, right? And the saga records that the harbor of the Joms Vikings encampment at Jomsborg, but it's this kind of mysterious locality. We don't pretty much know where it is, but along the Baltic coast, could hold up to 300 ships, right? Which is probably too much. The oldest version of the story actually says 3 ships, and 30 seems like a reasonable compromise. These systems would grow exactly through the predatory and systematic raiding that the same units enforce. So they were literally the ones who earned their own bread, right? And fueling the same system to happen. Eventually, was an enormous business where all the conditions for this thing to develop in those centuries, and they took this opportunity. In a very efficient way after all. And this system was so effective that the Joms Vikings were actually the pattern which the later Anglo-Danish huscarls was based. It's very interesting because it makes you understand how these systems eventually become institutionalized, in that case in the Anglo-Saxon kingdom, but properly as the product of, as we've seen, a professionally military system that had been developing outside of a state, being actually a small state on its own. And the main part of a national, as opposed to a raiding army, was supplied instead by the freemen. Talking both peasants and bondi, the main difference being lots of people in Scandinavia is just free peasantry living literally in the wild. Maybe not much differently from the Berserker lifestyle. Then there were the bondi, that were instead the land-owning farmers that were a bit better off. You have to imagine in this regard also the slaves, the thralls that had their own, that were raided themselves and deported to Scandinavia, etc., and working in these farms. And all this society had naturally its own military obligations that included very much like in the burghs in Anglo-Saxon England, for building of fortifications. So, as we have seen before, this is a society that invests in the military activity to get more money for itself at home, right? In this system, of course, these troops would, the freemen would have to serve, right? Those who failed to fulfill their duties were heavily fined, because technically, and this is already actually a softening of the traditional morals of Scandinavia, because originally, being a freeman was, and participating to the army was a duty but a privilege, conceptually speaking. Now, people said, oh, okay, I don't really want to go, and okay, you suck, but instead of killing you, I just fine you heavily. And technically, this was not true everywhere. Sometimes, they were ostracized, they were exiled, and this is valid a bit for all Scandinavian society for in other contexts, right? Also, the traditional roles remained there. Like, it wasn't really a free society; it was a highly regulated, after all. And the reason being that the metus hostilis, that was a society under pressure. So it's not that people could technically do whatever they want, right? There are very debatable, to say it euphemistically at least, interpretations of how free this society was before, Christianity, and if it absolutely not. Look at what happened to, I don't know, Frisian women if they, came out of their traditional roles, or think of look at what the faculties that these people had. Yeah, by law, but how they were actually enjoyed, and the weight that the clan and the rest of society had on an individual, actually. This was not like what we think like a free society at all. Not by the slightest. And it wasn't better before than afterwards under the Christian kings, right, of Scandinavia, at all. The interesting thing is that in time of emergency, as it actually happens basically in every society, even slaves at the trials that we mentioned before could be called up to arms. This is also kind of, can't say revolutionary, but, shocking probably for those times morals, that, a slave could be armed, could even have arms. There were systems of integration actually of slavery, that could be emancipated and freed after all in some ways, but generally speaking, that this is the picture of a system that is unhinged in itself from the original base. It's becoming larger, more flexible, but also more demanding in many ways. In absolute terms, right? In relative terms, it's still debatable, but and organization Viking armies was based on the Leidang. As we were saying before, we made a video about this. The Leidang is a levy of ships, men, and provisions, let's say, because, ships need men and provisions, all three of them are needed, technically, which seems to have evolved primarily in Denmark. And we don't know exactly when. As we were saying at the beginning, there are people who say, as early as the 6th century. The point is that wherever you find a military expedition, someone must have organized it in some way. So wherever the roots are, you could actually go very far back in time. Right? As we were saying before, we know Scandinavian piracy during the migration era, late Roman times, even before. So what are we talking about, actually? What did the Anglo-Saxons do, after all, from northwestern continental Europe? So the Leidang came to be regularized in mostly, we think, in the 10th century. Even if we don't understand, as we were saying at the beginning, much of the relation between, in fact, the number of ships, men, and provisions employed per community properly. The system, however, worked in this way. The coastal areas were divided up into ship raids that were districts that essentially, I think, especially in countries like Norway, are like at the same base of the local modern circumscriptions, because they were they were essentially based on think about the geography of the thing. Like there are those fjords, those bays, and that's basically it. And that's where the main center developed, etc. It's not always the case, but pretty much. And these ship raids that were already sea towns, basically, so that they were responsible for supplying the ships of a predetermined size and number. And each ship raid was divided into a number of so-called mangerts or lides, and a farm or group of farms, basically, that which each was obliged to supply one man over 18 years old, together with food and equipment for the laydown. Now, this is interesting, aside from the age, etc. But thinking of the how the whole society basically revolved around the laydown, right? Especially in Norway, you can suppose it was the most functionally projected towards the sea for obvious reasons, in which this probably changed in a way even things like equipment. Since, for example, like the longbows were an important feature, especially developed not just for land combat but also for ships, etc. And for the difficulties of let's not extend it on so much for under Norwegian example, but the missile fire is developed mostly for naval warfare. Also in other contexts, think about the crossbow for the Italian ships in parallel at this time, or other comparable realities. And the idea is that the least room you have to fight on land, take Norway, the more you may need. There was a rota system as well as a particular segmentation concerning the participation to the laydown, because single men were called up first, right? So that's a reminiscence of that comitatus thing, right? If you're a young man that is still not married, that is still young, you're eligible for this kind of more military activity. You're meant to culturally speaking to be called for that role, and functionally speaking too. Like the age of 18 there, we've seen the teenagers participated to expeditions, but the idea is that at this point, being regularized 18, we're basing ourselves on later sources, but it means not really just the young kids can go overseas to do what they'll have to do, because the thing is freaking brutal, and you need someone who is young enough but also resistant enough. And at this point there is probably a matter of physical resistance involved. Then farmers who had laborers to carry on while they were away, right? So this is mostly based on their wealth, and this is in other military systems, that there was also the segmentation in the sense, there was a sort of consortium where, 3 peasants put themselves together and said, okay, 2 will stay at home and the others will provide equipment for the third guy to go to war. This is somewhat similar, and of course these examples we're making now are not standardized. The thing was presumably more flexible, and these other options were present too. And last of all, farmers who had no laborers. So at that point, this is literally a matter of precedence. Let's say farmers with no laborers are people who have, if you call up to arms, they can't work, they can't produce. So it's a serious thing, and they are the last you want to call up, because those are needed by the whole community. But sometimes you have no choice. Everybody has to move. And once summoned, these levies had to appear on a shipboard within a few days, essentially, the ship crew constituting the smallest distinct army unit. And even here there is no certainty, but we think it's the case. Like as we have seen before, even the numbers of the companies were probably fitting larger ships, etc. The fact that you had to present yourself after a few days means also that these were, they were saying people who lived in the nearbys, right? So there isn't much of a time to summon. In Carolingian Europe, thousands of kilometers inland to arrive to the front line. It took months, right? This thing in 5 days. And deserters were outlawed, interestingly, as we were saying before. And judging from later sources, it was not necessarily the same man who served each year. So apparently it was a rota system, as we were saying before. The Leidang could be called at different levels of locally or nationally, for example, and frequently a half-national levy, the half-Leidang, was summoned, right? So a portion of it that could be based either on certain specific districts or less amount of troops was flexible. And this happened usually if an attack was planned against an enemy. The calling out of the whole army, the full Leidang, being generally reserved for facing foreign invasion or large-scale attack. The Leidang became even an instrument of, from the side of the major powers, the kings, to test the readiness of the communities, just even from a political point of view, like how many troops do we have available? Because if we sum up the world strength of these kingdoms, we get, they could, especially in later centuries where we have the information, lots of troops, but this is valid for every single kingdom out there. They could field, armies of, thousands of knights, but we all know that they couldn't, right? Simply because, first of all, the king had to pay usually to at least in those are later contexts, to summon these people. Then they would most wouldn't simply show up, right? And that stayed on paper. So this was a way to, and it had to be, carefully considered as well in this regard, because mobilizing these communities costed, and it costed politically speaking. Like, if you called them up too frequently, they could even stop participating in rebellion. And it was often Leidang was often summoned by beacons along the coast, otherwise by a war arrow being passed from district to district by messengers. Think about the communications of the time. The period, but it was still fairly quick, right? The idea is that communication at times, in fact, weren't that slow at all. Right, communications were quite fast at the time. Who had the interests and the money to make them travel? They made it travel extremely quickly. The period of Leidang service was possibly 4 months annually, at least, let's say, the good season. This is what we can see from the 12th and the 13th century. Albeit at that time, during Viking times, would have been much shorter, simply because the central power was weaker to enforce it. By the 10th century, we know that the Gulating law, that the Leidang service was 2 months. And telling the truth, the good season in Northern Europe, it's not particularly long, as you understand it. Going by sea, even just at the end of summer or early spring, is definitely not much of a joy. But they did it anyway, and if they had the interest, it's just a matter of calculating the odds. Large fleets could be obtained through the Leidang. King Horik of Denmark had a fleet of 600 ships in 845, allegedly. Right? Harald Bluetooth a full Leidang of 720 ships in 975. Knut the Great 850 ships in the early 11th century. Svein Ulfsson 720 in 1050, and Harald Hardrada a half Leidang of 240, 300, or possibly even 500 in 1066. In 1026, Sweden and Norway each raised 350 ships for a campaign against Knut, and he is supposed to have responded by levying a fleet of 1,200 ships from Denmark and England. Right. So here we're talking about large-scale commitment, not just for the amount of ships summoned, but properly because of the scale of organization and the communities that were meant to participate and to coordinate from literally the whole North and Baltic Sea. And Denmark, as we're recalling before, had population probably equaling the one of Norway and Sweden put together, right? And we have an estimate how many forces the Danes could put to sea, right? We have from the big dwellers 60 per 20 benchers plus another ship, no size known. Agder 16 per 25 benchers, Ordaland 24 per 25 benchers, Thirtmen 20 per 25 benchers, Raumdale 10 per 20 benchers, Trondelag 8 per 20 benchers, Halogaland 1 per 30 bencher and 13 per 20 benchers, Rogaland 24 per 25 benchers, Sogning 16 per 25 benchers, Møre 16 per 25 benchers, North Møre 20 per 20 benchers, and Naumdale 9 per 20 benchers. Right, so the total of this would be 1 for 30 benchers. It would be a 60-oared ship. 116 per 25 benchers. That is a 50-oared ships, and 120 per 20 benchers. That is a 40-oared ship. There's 40-oared ships plus one vessel of indeterminate size of 238 ships in all. And a modern estimate of the number of the men necessary to man this fleet is over 27,000. That is 100 men on a 20 bencher, 125 on a 25 bencher, and 150 on a 30 bencher. That would have been in this case the flagship, by the way. The numbers are large, but they kind of fit, generally speaking. Raiding fleets were usually smaller, right? They could vary in size. The very first raid in 789, just 3 ships, allegedly. Also, allegedly, the siege of Paris between 885 and 886, the Vikings would have brought 700 ships and 40,000 men, right? Suffering 19,000 casualties at the hands of the Carolingian relief force. Now, maybe they were not 40,000, but we're talking about in the range of tens of thousands. It would have been 20,000, right, realistically. And that would have still been huge for those time standards, but objectively, Paris was a pretty sizable city already at that time, especially for Northern European standards. We know of siege warfare, catapults employed by the same Vikings, so it was a huge deal, organizationally, logistically speaking, for the Northmen themselves. And the latter figures, however, smack of Chronicler's license, and most raiding fleets probably numbered no more than 10 to 35 ships. Right? It all depended, of course, on the, of who launched them. Right? For example, we know Orvar's Odd Saga mentioning a raiding force of 15 ships crewed by 120 men as each as very great, right? And that was definitely not a small expedition for those time standards, but we're talking also of different authors, different contexts, so we should enlarge the thing dramatically to make a consistent study about it. Also, the concentration of the troops here is important, because the problem is we don't have, this is all kind of hypothetical, right? We don't know exactly how many troops participated to these expeditions compared to the ships. I mean, it's complicated to determine. We don't have a clear evidence, if not the scattered, fortunate informations. But from the Leidang, we mostly know about the troops that had to serve as crews for manning the ships. We don't know how many people actually fought on them, but we know from the naval tactics of the times, however, that these ships were crowded. For the simple reason that, as I was saying before, most of naval warfare was about missile fire and boarding. So the mass of troops were very important. We know that the sides of Viking ships were, protected by shields that, created sort of loopholes for enabling to fire, security and receiving, much, fire from the side anyway. So the decks had to be loaded with this readily, these troops ready to fight. And the average Viking ship from the fortunate finds that we have, we think about Gokstad or we have determined it's roughly something between 65 to 85 or even 100 men, right? Remember the 100 we were talking about for the company in Viking Era? Well, yeah, that's probably the largest ships were suited for this kind of units. And considering that ideally also most of these companies would have been under strength, there was probably no standardization in that regard, but we can presume also during the raids, etc., there were different ways of transporting these people. But still, with this, numbers that can fit to a company unit level, realistic under strength situation. And the smallest ships permitted in any recorded Leidang being 26 oars, while 32, 40, and 50 oars were the standard, there being 2 men per oar in Scandinavian vessels. So the Saint warriors actually oared as well. And in battle, however, ships' complements could more than double, so that the largest had crews well in excess of 200. You understand how the thing worked. So all of Tryggvason's famous ship, the Long Serpent, had 68 oars, 30 for a side, and Svöld in the year 1000 was crewed by 8 men per half room plus 30 extras. That is, would make a total of 574 men, right? So a monster ship. And probably here we shouldn't underestimate the size, because the larger the ship is, of course, the less maneuverable it becomes, but it's still, something you have to aggress to have reason of, right? There is no ramming here, basically, and so the more troops you concentrate and the upper hand you get. And the other ships of similar size are recorded in the sagas. For example, Ardrada's 70-oared Great Dragon, right? But they were uncommon, right? Just the greater leaders, as Ardrada, just for example, could King of Norway could put to sea. And they also probably saw this types probably only saw home water service, right? Since their size, right, would make them unsuitable for ocean-going raids in general. So, of course, coastal navigation was the main thing in general. I mean, by sheer size of of troops employed on the long run, right? The crossing of open seas, it was a risky business. They did it, but they also preferred coastal navigation in general, so they tried to do it. And ships, as much as possible, and ships of this size only began to appear, by the way, at the close of the 10th century. So even in here we see how just, the late Viking era major powers began to feel this size of ships and, number of troops consequently. And this means, higher, that there is all a transformation of naval engineering as well, like the Viking ships of the early, let's say, of the late 8th century, not definitely the ones of the mid 11th, right? So there is, you can see there naturally the function that develops the instrument as such, and there were major improvements naturally, even the same naval engineering and the shipbuilding capabilities. And so on. And this is valid also generally for the equipment, for armor, weaponry, right? Much was bought also from elsewhere, but naturally the ships were something that the Vikings built by themselves mostly, because they used them in a unique way that other powers in Europe, basically aside from the Mediterranean, but in a very different context, with very different waters used. And the bondi levies of farmers was not regarded as altogether reliable, of course, and were frequently disbanded after only limited service if battle did not seem imminent, right? As we've seen, they were needed to look after the agricultural production. They also weren't good for much in combat compared to the herdmen, right? And therefore, the latter were the only ones that chieftains retained after the war season was over. And these, the herdmen alone could provide a large force right? The Ardrada's 150 ships at the Battle of Nissa, for example, so we could definitely talk again about a lot of other things, and as promised, we'll do it, and at some point, hopefully, at least, if I can, I will. You can be sure of it, and we will naturally analyze each one of these aspects more in detail, more extensively and intensively, and we will try to to connect. What I'm doing on this channel is essentially trying to form a net of like there's a central video like this that talks about the organization overall, and then there are these more specific videos that are not considered as lesser to this one, but that are connected to this one. From this one you can go look at the others, and the way you come across my videos doesn't really matter, but this is just to make you know that there is a structural system going on. This is not just a unique video saying, today I will talk about this so that I hope to get views and subscribers because I came up with the idea of the Viking armies today. No, this topics, as I said many times, are chosen randomly every day. So it just happened to be the case today, as it will happen that we'll talk about the others in who knows when. But the important is that this is going to form a broader interconnected system of videos that analyze in detail the world things that are connected to other topics, right? Because these are, and we will expand naturally on different levels in this regard. So anyhow, I always feel embarrassed when I address topics of such magnitude and make just like 2 hours videos of video. I don't know. I my videos are long, but I hope to say something meaningful in them, and I always you could hold some months class on this topic alone. So these 2 hours are really nothing in comparison. There's lots of bibliography, even if objectively relatively few about all this thing. I mean, if you want to go look at things in detail, there's a lot of things we can understand. But I think starting from the general and eventually descending into the details is also more. It's like putting clarity to shedding light on lots of things first, and then to progressively focus on them. Right? That's best in my opinion. Even if the random choice doesn't really follow that order, but I can start from the details. But anyhow, so this is not interesting for you, but it's just for clarifying, of course, what this whole thing is meant to be, right? And for the rest, there is the the terrain video actually that explains this better. But anyhow, for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.